Hi, everyone. I see people are still joining us, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to really welcome everybody to this meeting hosted by Spring Magazine. Super excited to have you all here today. Spring is a magazine of socialist ideas in action. It's produced by the Spring Socialist Network, and we're a group of socialists based in towns and cities across Canada, and we're active in many struggles and campaigns like the one for decent work in health, climate justice, labor, student, tenants' rights, social justice movements. Today's meeting is COVID, crime, and capitalism. And my name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm a member of Spring, and I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting. I am also a teacher, and I work in the housing justice movement, and I organize here in Vancouver, where it's really sunny today. And I'm on the unceded, occupied, and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. And Spring members recognize that Canada is a colonial state and an imperialist power that attacks and oppresses those within and without its borders. As an organization, we oppose Canadian colonialism and affirm the right to self-determination of Indigenous communities of the people of Quebec and of oppressed peoples everywhere. We seek to be a part of the struggles against all forms of oppression, and we want to learn from them as well. And in this, we recognize the unique oppressions faced by systematically marginalized peoples, and thus organize to offer a secure platform for them to center their struggles against oppression. We also recognize that the particular responsibilities of individual members of our organization who do not face these same oppressions to work in solidarity and allyship with them. So we today have 4 amazing speakers, super excited, and they've joined us to kick off the discussion. And after that, what I'll do is I'll open up the floor for comments and questions from all of you. And then at the end, each speaker will have a few minutes to address any questions and sort of wrap up. I'm just going to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Mariam Nazik, and she's a left-wing activist in the Ottawa area, and she's interested in issues facing Black, Indigenous folks and people of color and the environment. And she's going to speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll move to our next speaker. So Mariam, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi there, can you hear me? Is it good?
I can hear you, yeah.
All right, wonderful.
Awesome.
Let me just share my screen and we can get started. Okay, so hello there. So I'm going to talk with you about policing during the pandemic and how it looks during the pandemic. All right, so first I'll discuss with you the modes of policing that have increased during the pandemic, which have been fines and snitch lines. And I'll discuss with you trends that are sort of precursors to, are relevant to shifts in policing during the pandemic. And then finally, I'll discuss with you how the pandemic has affected prison conditions. So Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia have been the first provinces to mobilize the police towards COVID-19, and more enforcement has occurred under public health law rather than emergency law. And so the majority of enforcement actions have either been for failures to physically distance or failure to comply with minimal gathering rules. And the remaining enforcement actions have been for continuing to operate a non-essential business. And so the RCMP has been enforcing the Quarantine Act federally and has been assisting police organizations across provinces to enforce their enforcement efforts, including visiting homes to ensure anyone entering Canada is self-isolating for 14 days. And the police can now actually make arrests rather than issue a court appearance notice or a summons. So the vast majority of fines issued have been for failure to social distance, and most of those have been in Quebec. Also, we see that they are here in Ontario. And then $80,000 have been issued for non-essential business violations, most of which have been in Ontario. All right, and so as well, we see an increase in snitch lines. So the majority of which are here in Ontario. And so we can see here Michael Bryan, the director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, says that they are often unreliable and they can be bad government policy, and they can be full of neighborhood vengeance and family law disputes, where people presume to know the motivation of the person they're snitching on. And then it can end up being an outlet for rage and anxiety that ends up pressuring police and bylaw officers to overtake it instead of educating the public and warning people. And the end result is a response based on fear rather than science-based changing the behavior based on health expertise. Here I have a picture of an internet meme known as Barbecue Becky, where a white woman called the police on a black family using a charcoal grill in a non-designated area in California. And the incident has since become an infamous incident of racial profiling and vigilante policing, which snitch lines risk. And actually, interestingly enough, like a year later, as an anniversary to the event, I believe many Black activists in the area came back to the same spot to have an anniversary barbecue for Barbecue Becky. So Canada actually has a track record of criminalizing HIV transmission. It has one of the highest levels of criminal prosecution for HIV-related offenses in the world. This is because they criminalize both the actual transmission and the risk of transmission. So the risk of transmission is, ultimately, if you have if you have a high viral load, you have an obligation to either use a condom or to achieve antiretroviral therapy. Otherwise, you have to disclose your status. And so there aren't necessarily laws existing directly to it, but it's been prosecuted under common nuisance, sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, administering a noxious substance, attempted murder, and murder. And so those who defend the criminalization of HIV are those who believe in the use of criminal law to address social problems more generally. And so they say that the threat of punishment can deter unsafe behavior, it can convince people that unsafe behavior is wrong, that it supports a general social norm against this unsafe behavior, and that it incapacitates those who have a propensity towards unsafe behavior through imprisonment. And so we see here a similar logic being employed towards mass fining against those who fail to socially distance. But this approach is generally rejected by public health experts because they say that it can complicate and hinder the ability of health professionals to connect with patients due to a fear of criminalization and stigma amongst patients. So ultimately, transmission rates tend to be highest in the first 8 weeks after infection, and this is because people don't often know that they're infected, and patients can be afraid to speak freely with their health counselors because they fear that what they say could become evidence in a criminal trial. And so also public health experts argue that because there's variance in access to antiretroviral therapy, it means that some segments of HIV-infected populations will have to disclose their status, while more privileged individuals can avoid criminal liability altogether. And so also, finally, they prefer to endorse addressing structural factors which cause an epidemic and increase social supports to cope with it, rather than to criminalize it and then leave it to the cops. So Canada also has very serious problems with racial profiling through this often expresses itself through the policy of carding, or the community context policy, also known as street checks. So in Canada, the police can stop and question and document individuals without investigating a particular offense, and it's an intelligence gathering process. And so then a profile is built as a result of these street checks, and information is stored in the field information report database, and the information includes gender, race, the location of the interaction, the reason for the interaction, and the policy disproportionately affects Black and Indigenous Canadians. So in Montreal, Black and Indigenous people are 4 to 5 times more likely to be stopped by the police. Indigenous women are 11 times more likely to be stopped than white women. In Nova Scotia, Black people are more than 6 times likely to be stopped by the police than white people. And Vancouver Police Department found that between 2008 and 2017, 50% of the street checks involved Indigenous people, who are 2% of the population, and 4% involved Black people, who are less than 1% of the population. And so Scott Worthy, criminology professor at the University of Toronto, states that street checks have contributed to the criminalization of Black youth, eroded trust in law enforcement, and undermined the perceived legitimacy of the entire justice system. So the risk with the mass finding that we see going on during the pandemic is that these fault lines could be further exacerbated. And finally, I'd like to discuss the Safe Streets Act, which was passed by the Conservative Premier Mike Harris in 1999. And so it prohibits both the aggressive solicitation of persons in public spaces, as well as the disposal of certain dangerous things like hypodermic needles and condoms. they can so if the police feel that homeless people are disrupting public spaces, what ends up happening is they can issue tickets and fines, and then which can result in jail sentences in the long run, and so they largely go unpaid. Out of 67,000 tickets distributed between 1999 and 2010, worth $4 million, only 1% of fines have been paid, and out of 31,000 tickets worth $1.5 million issued between 2013 and 2018, only 38,397 were paid back. And so this complicates the relationship between those experiencing homelessness and those that would help them, because often they feel that they must leave spaces after they've been asked to by the police, and they can hide in more dangerous spaces. And then the fines add to economic hardship, and it pushes rough sleepers into the criminal justice system. So this is something to watch out for during the pandemic, because it's much harder to socially distance. Many of the spaces that homeless people would congregate in during the day are now closed for quarantine purposes. And as well, shelters are experiencing great pressure, and they're very hard to socially distance in. So Michael Bryant, director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, states that with homeless people, that they can either go outside and risk getting a ticket, but probably be able to socially distance themselves such that you're safer, or go inside to a shelter where you're toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose with everybody, and put yourself at grave public health risk. When you hand out tickets this big for what amounts to otherwise benign, harmless behavior, what you're doing is putting an undue burden on a vulnerable population. I could also conclude my presentation by discussing the conditions of prisons during the pandemic. So prisons have actually seen some of the most exciting activism in action during the pandemic. Prisons, meatpacking plants, and senior care facilities are the three hardest hit venues here in Canada. So at the Donnacona Maximum Security Prison in Quebec, tear gas and rubber bullets were used on inmates to quell unrest. And medium security Collins Bay Institution in Ontario, inmates protested the failure of guards to wear masks by refusing to return to their cells. And in return, guards used percussion grenades. And in Sarnia, jail's guards went on strike for 3 days in order to be allowed to use PPE. And at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre, correctional officers refused to work until screening measures were implemented. And so it is impossible in some cases to socially distance in prisons. They also often you have to share a washroom and shower with 20 to 30 people. And hand sanitizer is considered a contraband substance because hand sanitizers contain alcohol that authorities worry that inmates could consume. So only guards have sometimes spotty access to them. And it's important to remember. And so the many are advocating for releasing prisoners who are considered low risk. More than 50% of the prison population at any time is being held in a pretrial detention without ever being convicted of a crime. And bail violations, non-payment of fines, and non-violent offenses make up more than 2/3 of total prison population. And so it's important as well to remember that prisons are always highly racialized spaces. So for example, in Canada, 30% of inmates are Indigenous, while they're only 5% of the population. Indigenous women represent 42% of the female population. And most female prisoners are living with untreated trauma from sexual or physical abuse, and 3/4 have reported to live with mental illness, and 2/3 have substance abuse disorders. And so in Canada as well, the Indigenous prison population has grown by 44%, while non-Indigenous population has fallen in prison by 13.7%. And so Canada has been quite conservative in releasing low-risk prisoners. And while, for example, in Iran and France, they've released 50,000 and 5,000 prisoners, respectively. And so many people who are in prisons to begin with are people who are unable to find a spot for themselves in normative capitalist structures. People who are experiencing poverty, discrimination, and marginalization. I'd like to conclude a nice little quote saying that the unspeakable fact of capitalism and its tendency to eviscerate the whole collectives of people and then criminalize them for performing the predictable outcomes of that evisceration, one of the instrumental pathologies that fuels the production of prisoners, and namely poor people of color. And that's all I have to say.
Wow, that's super powerful. Thank you so much, Mariam. Next, we have Jessica Evans, who's a limited term assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University and a member of the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project. So go ahead, Jessica, we'll unmute you. Take it away.
There we go. Okay. So thank you for having me. What I'm going to do today is probably do a bit more of a conceptual discussion. So my background is academia, and so I kind of come at this from the perspective of political economy. So what I wanted to do today is kind of draw out two connections that I see as the relationship between capitalism, criminalization, and prisons. And then I want to flag what I see as perhaps some changes that we want to pay attention to in the current pandemic. So before I get going, I just want to kind of recognize that I am an uninvited settler, and I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And this is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Adirondack. So the two things that I want to kind of talk about today then are what function do prisons serve under capitalism, and how does that function shift? And then two, what is perhaps some of the particular kind of challenges or natures of prisons and jails in Canada, and what is COVID doing to those things? So to start off, I want to talk about capitalism as a surplus producing system. So capitalism produces surpluses of profits, surpluses of commodities, and surpluses of human beings, i.e. labor power. So this relates to Marx's conception of the reserve army of labor. And what Marx is kind of suggesting is that under capitalism, unemployment or surplus labor is not an anomaly, right? There is no such thing as full employment under capitalism, but rather unemployment or surplus labor is functionally necessary to capitalism. And it's functionally necessary for two reasons, or two primary reasons. The first is that capitalism as a mode of production is constantly trying to kind of transform the process of production in order to move increasingly towards labor-saving technologies and forms of production. What that means is that the needs of labor at any given time, or the needs for labor at any given time, and in any given sector of the economy are constantly shifting. And so people are constantly being pulled into and ejected from the economy as the structure of production changes. The other reason that this surplus is so necessary is because surpluses, if you have a surplus of unemployed populations, those function as kind of a disciplinary factor on existing employed bodies, right? So if I want to go on strike and say, fuck these conditions, but there are, hundreds or thousands of other people that are willing to take that job under the conditions that exist, then I am more likely to just swallow the conditions as they are and go about my job, right? So these are the two functions of the reserve army of labor. And why I bring this up is because of the ways in which these surpluses become absorbed by the prison system, and how criminalization functions to absorb, when necessary, these kinds of surpluses. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm thinking of the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who wrote a fantastic book called The Golden Gulag, where she attempted to understand the massive expansion of prisons in California in the 1980s. And what Gilmore was suggesting was that prisons function to absorb surpluses during kind of crises under capitalism, right? So when you have significant shifts in production systems, you produce massive surpluses of labor, surpluses of profits and capital that needs to be invested, all those kinds of things. And prisons serve the function of absorbing and fixing those surpluses. So one of the things that Gilmore suggested was that, you saw this massive expansion in policing and mass incarceration in the 1980s because of transition to neoliberalism, right? And with the transition to neoliberalism, you saw a fundamental restructuring of the labor process and a lot of kind of lower end or lower tier jobs in manufacturing and those kinds of things. Those became farmed out in ways to other parts of the world, or they got replaced by different forms of technology. And so you saw this massive unemployment in kind of the lower skilled sectors of the economy. And this disproportionately was impacting in the US, but also in Canada, Black and brown bodies. And so what do you do with all of these unemployed folks who have the potential to significantly disrupt power in the economy by collectively organizing against that? well, one thing that you can do is you can start to jail them, right? And so what we saw in the 1980s, the 1970s and the 1980s was the war on drugs, right? So all of a sudden, the criminalization of a particular behavior, that became a means of pulling people off the streets, pulling people who could challenge the system, right? And containing them, disempowering them, and so on and so forth. And so as evidence to this kind of, this strategy, we can look at the numbers that were kind of circulating around drug enforcement in the US. So between 1980 and 1984, anti-drug funding from the FBI rose from $8 million a year to $95 million. In the Department of Defense, anti-drug funding from 81 to 91 rose from 33 million to 1,042 million. So this speaks to a mass kind of shift in what we deemed criminal activities, what we deemed like the activities that people can be detained for. After the global recession, we see another shift. So the global recession happens, and there again are all of these surpluses of unemployed labor. Now, those who had been displaced during the 1970s and the 1980s, their jobs were often taken up by precarious migrant labor. And so after the Great Recession, or the financial recession of 2008, 2009, 2007, 2008, what you saw is an intense project of criminalizing migrant labor. Because of course, the sectors of the economy which shed jobs during this period were those that tended to be heavily occupied by temporary migrant workers, people with precarious status, and so on and so forth. So what I'm pointing to here is the fact that every time there is a shift in the nature of the economy and the production process, you see a recomposition of labor markets. And with that recomposition comes the shedding of significant parts of labor. One of the things then that I am focusing on right now, and I don't have answers to this, but I'm just trying to point us to some things to think about, is after COVID, when the economy starts to rebuild, what jobs are going to lay on the wayside, right? And whose bodies then become subject to this kind of carceral absorption process. So that's one thing that I wanted to think about. And of course, who we choose and what we choose to criminalize in these processes, these also speak powerfully to how we define our various spaces and identities vis-a-vis the nation, right? So we begin to define certain bodies, certain behaviors as not us, and therefore amenable to detention by the criminal injustice system. So that's one thing that I'm kind of thinking through. The other thing, if I have time to just kind of quickly go over, is a little bit more specific about the nature of jails in Canada, and something that I want to kind of look at. So since the global financial recession, this started a little bit before the recession, but it's really picked up significantly since the recession. Many jails in Canada that are being built or that are being kind of rejigged are having these things done through what's referred to as public-private partnerships. So in Canada, we don't have private prisons like we do in the US. They still remain under public jurisdiction and control. But nonetheless, what we are starting to see is the inclusion of private actors through public-private partnerships. Now, public-private partnership usually is an agreement whereby the state retains control over the kind of operation of the facility, but things like the design, the finance, the maintenance, and the building of the institution or of the facility, that is contracted out to private actors. Since 2008, I believe, we have had a significant increase in prisons being built through public-private partnerships. I'm just trying to look at the numbers here. So since 2008, a total of 5 correctional facilities were built through these, and several more are being proposed right now. So I think there's another 6 or 7 that are being proposed. What happens with these facilities is that they also expand the capacity. So every time you see a facility being built, it is also building more beds. Now, why does this matter? Well, one of the reasons that it matters is because when a government enters a contract with a private actor through a public-private partnership, they are committing themselves to fund that piece of infrastructure for a significant period of time. So normally these contracts last about 30 years. And a small portion of the total contract's worth is paid out upon completion. and then the rest of it is doled out in monthly payments over the course of 30 years. And what that means then is that governments are committed to operating those facilities for 30 years. And in order for those to be kind of worthwhile, they have to be occupied. And so in effect, governments are committing themselves to a policy of criminalizing and incarcerating particular bodies over that course of time. So while right now we are seeing the release of people from provincial jails, and that is certainly something that I applaud, given the nature of the construction of many of these provincial jails, the fact that they are on the hook, right? The governments are on the hook for these costs for the next 30 years, they're not going to remain empty forever. And so once again, the question is raised, who is going to be filling these spaces once again? How are we going to get bodies back in these spaces? Not that I want that, but this is from the perspective of those that are operating these facilities, because governments are already committed to paying out millions of dollars over the next 30 years for these spaces. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about then is after all of this, right, we're seeing a significant decarceration, but that's not likely to be the trend going forward. And we need to be quite vigilant, right, and quite active in kind of pushing back against attempts to criminalize. And these are things that were raised by Mariam just a few minutes ago. What new forms of criminalization are we seeing? Well, we're seeing the criminalization of a lack of ability to socially distance. And who can't socially distance? Well, usually quite vulnerable communities. The final thing that I wanted to kind of flag in terms of public-private partnerships, and this is just kind of an aside, but with a public-private partnership, depending on the nature of the partnership, so there's design, finance, and build, or there's design, finance, build, and maintain. So for example, Toronto South Detention Centre was constructed through a design, finance, build, and maintain model, which means that the private actor is responsible for the maintenance of all kind of infrastructure on an ongoing basis. They have to deal with any repairs, and the state cannot step in to do anything about that. They have to give the private partner adequate time to first take those things on. Now, Toronto South has been notorious for having significant lockdowns, and these lockdowns often occur because of maintenance issues, right? So the private partner has not responded to these maintenance issues, and those maintenance issues become justification for prolonged lockdowns. Now, one thing that I was just noticing, I was looking through the Toronto South project agreement, is that there are provisions made, what are referred to as kind of excusable clauses, whereby under conditions, for example, of a medical outbreak, the private partner is absolved of their need to respond in a timely manner. So this won't count against them. If something gets broken in Toronto South, that would be cause for a lockdown, if the private partner chooses not to respond in a timely manner because of the current situation with COVID-19, this would not count against them, right? They would not be financially or politically penalized for not responding. And so once again, the nature of public-private partnerships as they kind of fold out or unfold in prisons has kind of significant ramifications under COVID. So I think that's where I'm going to kind of end right now. So once again, my concerns are in terms of prisons being used to absorb surplus populations, who is going to be made redundant and therefore surplus or absorbable in the aftermath of all of this. And then two, because of the nature of jails in Canada being funded and built through public-private partnerships, we also have to acknowledge that what we're seeing today as gains vis-a-vis kind of decarceration, I'm weary because I think that's going to be pulled back very quickly. And this again is because of the nature of these ongoing long-term commitments to these specific pieces of infrastructure.
Great. Well, that's not great, but obviously, thank you so much for that, Jessica. That was really informative. Next, we have our next speaker is Sarome Rowe, who is an organizer at the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, leading the Migrant Students United project, and organizes also with Foodsters United on the Justice for Foodora Couriers unionization drive. So Sarome, we'll unmute you and you can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that there's so many of us in this room here. And as Mariam and Jessica have brilliantly laid out, I think I will be echoing a lot of the things that they've said. I mean, we're gathered today, and it's the day before Mother's Day, and I'm thinking about all the racialized women and parents who can't take the day off tomorrow, and all the migrant care workers who cannot be with their families because capitalism and border imperialism continue to keep us separated. I'm also thinking about how outside health facilities, the largest outbreaks of COVID-19 are in industries with migrant workers. So you know this: Byland Nurseries, Green Hill Produce, JBS Meatpacking, and Cargill Meat. And outside workplaces, sites of incarceration, prisons, and detention centers are also seeing massive outbreaks. Mariam and Jessica's amazing presentations have also reminded me of the 32,000 people that have been jailed in immigration prisons under the current Trudeau government. As I go through and speak with you all today, I'm thinking about all these folks. So a couple days ago, I was speaking at an event on essential workers, and one of the questions I was asked to speak to was about the supports and resources that are available to workers and the best protections essential workers can take to protect themselves. The answer is simple, and I said this there and I'll say it again: it's organizing. Organizing is the best way we can protect ourselves. It is the most meaningful, resourceful, and transformative way. As the first two speakers have very clearly laid out, in the face of growing police and detention powers, carding, street checks, and status checks, aggressive immigration enforcement, our people are organizing. So this is week 8 of the crisis, and as we entered the crisis full throttle in mid-March, it just became all the more urgent that we organize, and specifically organize to build organizations and forms of assembly so that our people can fight for justice, not just in the immediate crisis, but in the months and years that will follow it. Racialized women and youth, migrants and undocumented people are particularly impacted by the global pandemic and the deathly gaps of the systems that are leaving them behind. We're seeing this every day. We're hearing from our people, they're calling us, we're seeing on the news, we're getting messages, we're just flooded by the news about how deathly inadequate these systems are. So at MWAC, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, our response to this crisis is led by principles of solidarity, worker self-determination, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism, all in service to a worker-led movement. What this has looked like for us is listening to the core issues, demands, and priorities for change that our worker members and worker leaders have directly raised. So MWAC is Canada's largest coalition of self-organized migrant groups and migrant workers' rights organizations. We speak for ourselves. And the project that I'm leading, Migrant Students United, is a project by MWAC, and we have been organizing international students as migrant workers. So rather than using this language of international or foreign students, students call themselves migrant students because they are united with migrants like farm workers, care workers, undocumented people, and refugees who are coming through the same immigration system. As I'll talk about a bit later, this is a two-tiered immigration system that is bent on causing precarity. There is an estimated 1.2 million migrant students in Canada, and many work dangerous, low-wage jobs and don't have access to basic labor protections, working in food and retail, service, cleaning, warehouses, and delivery industries. Many have fallen out of status and make the difficult decision to stay and become undocumented because the forces of capitalist imperialism has destabilized their countries. Many of the students work in low-wage logistics industries like warehousing and delivery. So to give an example, and as Lisa mentioned, I also organize with Foodsters United. So on May 1st, so May Day last year, Foodora couriers and delivery workers publicly announced that we were unionizing with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and started our drive. The majority of our workforce, as is reflective in the gig economy, is racialized people and workers with temporary or precarious immigration status. So Foodora, like Uber Eats, DoorDash, Skip the Dishes, is a tech and logistics company. Workers use the app to pick up and deliver orders, and we get paid per order and often can't make the hourly minimum wage. These companies misclassify workers as quote unquote independent contractors and deny them basic labor rights and protections. They treat their workers disposably and operate knowing that there will be a lot of turnover and instability in the workforce, which makes it difficult for workers to organize. On top of that, independent contractors are not allowed to unionize. So in addition to the fact that we have no single shop floor, no single site where we can access our fellow workers, there are rules that make it difficult for us to unionize and organize. So in Ontario, for example, provisions that we won in Bill 148 that for one would have made it easier to unionize were rolled back by the Ford administration, in addition to many other things that I'm sure many of you know of. For Fedora couriers, we challenged this misclassification and won the right to unionize at the Ontario Labour Relations Board earlier this year. This is gig work, and these multinational tech companies profit off of increasing precarious labor in the gig economy. So the logic of work is structured and maintained by the reality that Canada has a two-tiered immigration system, where there is a logic of temporariness embedded right into the system. So masses of workers, migrant workers, arrive to Canada on temporary permits and have limited access to permanent residency. This is an intentional system. For example, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, for its existence for 53 years, has not allowed migrant farm workers access to permanent residency. There's a program, an interim pilot program that's being rolled out later this week or in the week coming, but still this is largely inadequate. It was one because migrant farm workers were organizing, but it's still largely inadequate, but we continue to organize. So this two-tiered immigration system creates a revolving door where workers, primarily from the global south, are exploited for their labor without having a sense of stability. They work and live while facing precarity, often under extreme surveillance and immigration enforcement. So as has been noted many times over, what this pandemic has exposed and exacerbated are existing structural inequalities. An example of the deathly inadequacies of this crisis response for migrants is the active SIN requirement for the CERB, for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. This is a major barrier for undocumented people and people with precarious status. At a national press conference a couple of weeks ago, migrant and undocumented workers spoke up about these gaps to the emergency income supports. And one of our Migrant Students United members spoke about being unable to access CERB because her SIN expired due to delays in immigration processing times. For the recently announced Canada Emergency Student Benefit, migrant students or international students do not qualify. And on the same day that the CESB was announced without including migrant students, the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, the IRCC, removed the restriction of work hours for international students working in essential services. So no access to income supports, but the imperative is to work more to survive. But migrant students from coast to coast, alongside their farm worker, care worker, and undocumented comrades, are speaking up and building power. I think for many of us right now, we're seeing that the conversation is moving towards recovery and reopening the economy. We see many politicians using divisive language to urge cutting back on income supports. Many low-wage essential workers, like gig and migrant workers, were already forced to work through the crisis without access to emergency supports, and now we're seeing that even more are being urged to go back to work. In the months coming, under the banner of austerity and balancing the deficit, we will see a global economic downturn that will impact our people the most. The ruling class will continue to criminalize us, criminalize poor and racialized people, queer and trans people, migrants, and undocumented workers. They will continue to keep us divided through obfuscating tactics like fear-mongering and fomenting racist, anti-migrant xenophobia. They call us criminals when they are in fact the criminals. Employers who steal our wages, multinational companies who profit off of increasing labor flexibilization, temporariness, and precarity, who keep pushing down our wages tear basic worker protections and rights, and then, like in the case of Foodora, unilaterally decide to pull out at their whim without any responsibility to their workers, these are the criminals. It's also their friends in positions of political power, and Jessica outlined the private-public partnership, increasing private partnership very well, but it's the ruling class who work together to keep the global capitalist machine running. They are the criminals, and they dare to criminalize us. They dare to criminalize our people. I see in the comments here that folks are writing shame, but yes, shame. James says lock them up, that's right. So many, I mean, the comments alone show this. So many of us in this room, this virtual room that we're gathered in, organized to win and to win changes. And just in the past 8 weeks together, we've won so many things. One, we've won reversals to the border closure for some migrants, and our efforts have led to changes in CERB multiple times. You know, at first it was only for Canadian workers, very much in this language of citizenship, and now it's expanded to all residents. But we know migrants and undocumented people have spoken up and said themselves that there's more to be done. We have to continue to fight for worker protections and permanent resident status for all precarious, low-wage migrant and undocumented workers. We entered the crisis after Indigenous land defenders and water protectors shut down Canada. And as both the pandemic and the crisis caused by capitalism rages on, Indigenous people are still fighting the forces of this illegal, criminal, extractive settler colonial state. As my colleague Hassan has reminded me, we must continue to shut down Canada. We have to continue to organize and collectively build our resistance to the onslaught of austerity and heightened surveillance and policing. And as we refuse to return to their notions of normal, because the fact is we are not going back to normal, we must continue to imagine and build new transformative worlds together. Worker power is forever, and we're never backing down. And I'll leave it there.
Woo, awesome. Thank you so much, Sarome. That was fantastic. We have one more speaker, and that is Krishna Saravanamuthu, who is a community organizer and a journalist. He studies law at Osgoode Hall in Toronto, and he's also a member of Spring. And I think you're unmuted, Krishna, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you so much to all of the speakers that have preceded me. I was paying attention to Mariam's excellent kind of analysis around the breakdown of a racialized arrest powers, fines, the underlying ideology of racism within the criminal justice system, the history that we've seen through things like the Safe Street Acts, and how already within this pandemic, the types of fines and arrests that we've seen have in some ways reached above and beyond what even the Safe Streets Act was able to do, which to me is remarkable. I really appreciated Jess's contributions around surplus labor and the basic but essential argument that capitalism needs prisons, capitalism needs racism. And so the implication of that is that as socialists, as revolutionaries, as anti-capitalists, we need prison abolition and we need anti-racism. And I truly, truly appreciated Sarome's contribution to help us kind of understand the two-tier immigration system that exists in this country, and the way in which, again, it is racialized people from the global south that are the most disenfranchised, the most dispossessed, and the most exploited. And so any meaningful struggle against capitalism must center anti-racism. Now, I'm a refugee from Sri Lanka, and I've been involved with anti-racism campaigns since I was a kid. And so it truly is, again, an honor to be here on this panel with Sarome, Mariam, and Jess, who are doing such critical work across the city and across the country. And I also just want to take a moment to thank Lisa, our chair, and to thank James and Peter, who are behind the scenes, who are doing the tech support, because this is such an important conversation. This conversation doesn't end here. The work that we are all doing in our organizations and our movements needs to continue happening even after this pandemic is over. And we need to be doing it together because we know that these issues are not separated. We know that these issues do not exist in isolation. They are interconnected, and so the response has to be interconnected. We cannot separate these issues into their component parts and hope that somehow we will be able to abolish the systems that oppress all of us. We need to be working together. We need to continue strengthening our alliances with each other. Now, we know that just 2 weeks into the quarantine measures that shut down the country, the Canadian government closed its doors on refugees who were crossing the border by foot from the United States, essentially violating our commitments under international law to the 1951 Convention on Refugees. The Prime Minister's decision to close down the border could very well be a violation of one of the Supreme Court's own binding decisions in a case called Singh, which is a groundbreaking decision in refugee law, which promises refugees a fair hearing based on the principles of fundamental justice. Soon after, we saw, of course, expectedly, a similar kind of response from the American border officials who announced that anyone who was going to be returned to the U.S. would be returned back to their original country, which is a huge violation of one of the founding principles of international refugee law, which is that governments do not return asylum seekers back to countries where they face fear or very real persecution or torture. The border closing itself, it has been lifted to some degree, but nonetheless, it really reveals something about the way in which capitalism itself needs borders. Now, the closing transpired in the backdrop of something called the Canada-USA Third Country Agreement. Under that agreement, Canada will turn away asylum seekers who come through the US and attempt to enter Canada at official border crossings. Prior to the agreement, an asylum seeker could request refugee protection upon arrival at any port of entry. But under the STCA, refugees are obligated to apply for asylum in the first country in which they arrive. But of course, refugees are very resilient people, and they found a loophole in the agreement. They were able to take advantage of a section of the agreement that was silent about unofficial border crossings, like the one at Roxham Road between New York and Quebec. So it's these unofficial border crossings that the Canadian state has now shut down, making it impossible for many refugees to seek asylum. And then we have to kind of humanize this problem. Who are these people that are seeking asylum in this country? They are families that are fleeing war and persecution from countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Yemen, Lebanon, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Eritrea, Palestine. All of these are human beings, families that are seeking to come into this country to often flee war and persecution that in many ways was initiated by our own country. And I'll get into that a little bit later on. But understanding the process of state violence against refugees and migrants is critical to our understanding of how capitalism structures both our society here, but also our world. And you know, we don't have to look too far back. We can think about the Komagatumaru incident, or even more recently, the MV Sansi, the ocean lady, and the way in which the ruling class pushes racism because it divides the forces that would challenge their power. And I think this is such a crucial point that Sorel made. That racism exists to divide us. It exists to divide you and I from each other so that we cannot challenge our rulers. Racism ultimately benefits capitalism. Now, this policy of keeping working class people like you and I divided from each other also reminds me, though, of something that Marx and Engels had written about, these very famous words that now resonate in every corner, across every ocean, throughout every continent of this world. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Workers of the world, unite. And to me, that's a recognition of the internationalist character of struggle for a better world. And it's also a recognition that capitalism as a ruling ideology doesn't pay attention to borders, it doesn't pay attention to boundaries, and so we shouldn't either. And this strategy of divide and rule, it only strengthens the ability of capitalists to exploit working class people. We know that those who control the means of production also control the way that society thinks, the way that we kind of govern ourselves through particular types of ideologies. And where does that ideology of racism is to be considered not just an overt physical manifestation, but also an ideology that can exist far more subtly. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the advent of capitalism itself. We know that it was developed systematically as an ideology to justify the brutal transatlantic slave trade. And today, the fundamental role of racism in our society, again, is in dividing you and I from each other, dividing the mass of people who control little or next to nothing, and thus entrenching the power and authority of the ruling class. I'm reminded of ideas around primitive accumulation. How is it that in the first place, people who have capital and those who do not have capital, how did those realities come to be? Well, it happened through violence. It happened through war. It happened through slavery. It happened through colonialism. So there's a long history of the ruling class attempting to scapegoat refugees. And again, I want to return to this point. These are refugees that are often created by these countries, the ruling class's own imperial policies. But it's refugees that are blamed for the social and economic crisis of the day. We only have to look at the exclusion of farm workers, the exclusion of refugees, the exclusion of prisoners from our pandemic relief efforts to see how racism is still the organizing principle of this society today. And migrants provide a useful focus to divert anger over poverty, over job losses, over lack of services. This means that even at times when the ruling class has encouraged immigration to boost its profits, it has also stoked the fires of racism at the same time. And I just have to think back to my community's experience. We came here in the late 80s, the early 90s. At that time, Canada was hailed as a benevolent force in the world, welcoming Tamil refugees from a country that was brutally divided by war. At the same time, what happened? These were Tamil refugees that were facing poverty, next to no social support, often harassed by the police, often targeted for terrorism and for gang-related charges. And we were the ones who were often being stigmatized the worst at that time. And so while Canada increased its workflow, those of us who were working in the back of kitchens, picking up garbage, cleaning the toilets, doing the things that other people didn't necessarily want to do, we were also being stigmatized with racism. So the other part of the story that I don't want to miss out here is that racism was consolidated and entrenched through empire. And this search for profit that drove European conquest in the first place, it's not a thing of the past. It's very much a reality today that drives displacement across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Asia. It's not a grievance for the history books. It's not part of the post-colonial moment. Again, it's something that informs the reality of refugees today. Imperialism forces people to leave their homelands. All we have to do is look at the NATO bombing campaigns in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Mali, Niger, Somalia, Iraq, just to name a few, to understand how these bombing campaigns carve out the migration patterns that we see across Europe, the United States, and Canada. And meanwhile, this country, Canada, provides unwavering support for extractive projects like Canadian mining companies in Eritrea or Canadian mining companies in Guatemala that then bolster up repressive regimes, which then force people to flee northwards. And then what happens when they come here? When refugees and migrants arrive here, they face unjust border restrictions. And so the Prime Minister's decision to close off the border very soon after quarantine was announced is something that hides the way in which this country and its allies in the global north actually create the refugee crisis in the first place. Now, we know that racism can be subtle. It's far more dangerous because it can be denied by, for instance, taking on the form of a government policy like the closure of the border to stop the spread of the virus, as if somehow the virus would recognize these imaginary lines conjured up by our Prime Minister. But what we do know is that racism is integral to capitalism. It's the capitalist system that is constantly finding ways to renew itself and reinvent itself through racism. So we need to fight racism wherever we find it, whether it's at these imaginary borders, whether it's on the streets, whether it's in our workplaces, whether it's in the prisons that are storehouses for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. We are not going to dismantle capitalism without dismantling racial capitalism. And so I want to return to the point that I started with. In order to confront the totality of capitalism within our society today, we need to build alliances based on solidarity with people that are targeted by racism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Krishna. That was awesome. Thank you to all of our speakers. That was just incredible. I'm now going to open it up for discussion. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And I'll take a speakers list. And it really helps me if you know how to use the raise hands function, because I can't see everybody's screen if you use your in real life hand. And if you can't use the raise hands function, you could always type something into the the chat and someone will point you out to me. So if people want to make a comment or have a question, there's just so much food for thought in these presentations. I know it probably will take folks a minute just to process what they want to say, but I'll take as best I can an equity speakers list. So when I call on speakers, I do my best to give priority to members of equity seeking groups and also to first-time speakers. So I'm just looking for hands. And while I do look for hands, I just wanted to say that I just thought that so many fantastic things in those presentations, but I really, Mariam, one of the things you said just about how there's the criminalizing of homeless folks and how there's such a criminalizing of all the public health aspects of the pandemic that really should be dealt with as public health issues, and how that disproportionately affects Black and Indigenous peoples. We definitely see that in Vancouver. You know, it's kind of ironic that it's not just racist for them to do that, but it also goes against good public health policy. It's just really, that's the crime, right? The way the state is treating things. So if people want to get on the speakers list, if they could raise their hand or put something in the chat, then that would be awesome. Oh, I see a hand. There's so many participants. I found Pam. You look like you're first. Go ahead, we'll unmute you.
Thank you. Yeah, just a huge thanks to all the speakers. So powerful, and I think there is a lot to process. And what is exciting for me is to see how all of these pieces fit together and coming at it from an international perspective, because I just think that's so crucial. If we limit ourselves only to thinking these things through in one country, I think we're going to miss a big piece of the puzzle. And so just some of the things that I was thinking about from the speakers, I was thinking about, you know, how borders, you know, really they're literally a figment of our collective imaginations, but they were enforced with the most violent and vicious resources, you know, the armies and the, you know, border patrols and so forth. So it takes a huge amount of legal force from the state to persuade us that borders are real things that we ought to be respecting. And I remember one of, when COVID was first striking, there was an epidemiologist that basically said, there's literally no evidence that border control does anything to contain contagion. It simply prevents people from getting to where they need to go with their families and loved ones and support networks and so forth. And it has the additional effect of diverting resources away from actually fighting the virus, providing healthcare, providing the resources that people need to cope with it. So that's one thing. But the thing that I've also, all the speakers made me think about while they were talking is it's just how the ruling class is fighting for its own survival. And we have had a massive economic meltdown as a result of COVID, which means the stakes for the ruling class are very high because people are seeing how horrible the safety net is. They're seeing the unfairness. They're seeing the wretched working conditions. Even around migrant workers and, you know, the beekeepers, like people who are talking, you know, farmers, like employers, I should be saying, are more or less saying, we need our migrant workers. They're the only ones with the skills that can do this really high skilled work. We can't just take any old Canadian off the street to do this work. We need our people. And so this is really becoming clear to people, but that in itself is a huge threat to the 1%, which reminds me that the racist card is going to get played more viciously than we can even begin to imagine, and why it feels really necessary that we have these conversations and practice building that solidarity. And then just the last thing I wanted to say is that we think about work and the hardships of people losing jobs and the lack of income supports as well. And I just wanted people to also think about the impact in a global scale of the loss of remittances for workers who have been migrant workers who have been thrown out of work, or people who even have status here in Canada, but whose incomes actually form an integral part of economies of other countries, and how, you know, the financial resources, yes, we have to think about what our own national governments are doing, but we also need to be thinking much more globally and preparing the groundwork for a real sense of international solidarity. And that's why I do think the question of regularization, full status now, is it's in some ways it's becoming more and more of an obvious conclusion, but it's also a really radical conclusion. And if we follow this along, it really can, I think, pose the question of the whole entire system. So international solidarity is our means of actually getting after capitalism, because nothing can sustain itself without borders and racism.
Thank you, Pam. Next, I have Valerie. Valerie will unmute you. Go ahead.
Thanks to the fabulous presenters on the panel. I learned a lot of new things, especially the public-private partnerships in the prison system in Canada. I wasn't aware of that at all. And the international student struggles that are happening, there was really a lot of new information there. So thanks very much to all the presenters. I just wanted to pick up on the point that I see reinforced in the chat, but made by Krishna and others about how taking on racism has to be at the heart of the struggle against capitalism, and also the interconnectedness of all the struggles. And we have finally seen the arrest, who knows what will happen, but the arrest of the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery. And you know, ever since Trump was elected, we've certainly seen the far right coming out from under its stones, out of its caves. But it does speak to the interconnectedness of the struggles, where today the people leading the liberate us, let us go back to work, or let you go back to work, protesters in the United States and some here in Canada, very explicit links with the organized far right, who are also a lot of climate deniers as well. And so this COVID has provided yet another opportunity for the far right to become more emboldened, more visible, more vocal. And so again, just the need for us to be able to strengthen the movements that support Indigenous sovereignty, that support prisoners' rights. And I'd like to hear more about some of the prisoners' rights struggles, either from the panelists or from other people in the chat. The migrant workers that are self-organizing and have been for some time, and the fight for decent work, which will help all workers, but particularly the most vulnerable. And here in Toronto, we have the Workers' Action Centre, and provincially, the Fight for 15 campaign. And I know there's an important meeting coming up this Tuesday, and I'm wondering if Pam, if you can put that in the link, because it's a joint meeting of the Ontario Federation of Labour and the Fight for 15. Which will link not all of these issues necessarily, but a lot of important ones. So that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Next, I had Adam. Adam, we can unmute you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I really like this, this theme that's going on about how racism, capitalism, and prisons all need one another to survive. The anti-capitalists need prison abolition, the prison abolitionists need anti-capitalism. We all need to center the voices of migrants, the voices of racialized people. I really appreciate that. Oh, I was thinking about something Jess was saying earlier about how prisons sort of they absorb the surpluses of capital, and they absorb the people who are made surplus. And I'm thinking also, it sort of made me think about, with what Krishna was saying about how refugees and how migrants are also absorbed through these systems, not just through their criminalization and their sort of disproportionate targeting for criminalization as Black and brown bodies, but also through immigration controls, and how migrants, refugees, anyone who's not, I guess, like a Canadian citizen in big scare quotes, can be absorbed through immigration detention. They can be held administratively on a lower standard of proof than they would need to hold someone through the criminal law power. And I'm thinking also about how, immigration controls, deportation, these threats of immigration can always be held over refugees and migrants. And so I'm wondering if anyone here today or any of the panelists can sort of speak to immigration detention and the absorbing of migrant surpluses, especially in the context of, what we've been seeing in Laval and hunger strikes in immigration detention centers.
Excellent question. Thank you so much, Adam. I see Jessica has put herself on the list, so maybe Jessica would like to just come back on some of that. And then I have Michael, and then we could probably take a couple more speakers. I think it's okay if we go a few minutes over time, because it's just such valuable valuable conversation. So Jessica, have someone unmuted her? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd initially just thrown myself up there to respond to Valerie. I'm going to drop some links in the chat below because I have been organizing with the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project. So we are doing a lot of kind of solidarity work right now. We started a prisoner emergency support fund, and we're not donating. We're collecting donations. We've raised a little over 20,000 so far. We have an application that those who are either being recently released or those that are still inside can fill out or have a loved one fill out. And then we're distributing one-time stipends of about $225. It's not a ton, but it does help for folks inside. They can obtain perhaps some cleaning materials. They can obtain calls, those kinds of things for folks getting out. It goes a little bit of the way to food and bus tickets and stuff like that, because we know that people that are being decarcerated right now, there's no plan for them. They are literally like the doors are opened and they are sent on their way. No bus tickets, nothing. And so that's part of what we're doing right now. We're also organizing for releases in federal institutions. So right now, folks in federal institutions have not been deemed eligible for any kind of release. Some lawyers are starting to kind of poke at that. But that's another piece of what we're doing. So I'll post some links below. And if anyone has family members that are recently released or that are currently inside, I'll also link you to the application for the fund that we're doing right now. To come back very quickly on Adam's point around immigration detention, absolutely, like I think, and so in the comments I kind of mentioned that I have a piece coming out that deals somewhat with this. But I think, once again, we rely heavily on temporary migrant labor and precarious migrant labor. And after the financial recession, a lot of the industries that were heavily occupied by those precarious status folks, they were decimated. And so this is where we started to see a real uptick in so-called crimmigration, right? The application of criminal policy or criminal-like treatment to migrants. And so you saw a significant rise in detention statistics after that point in time. I also just wanted to flag that prisons have always been used to mark out the boundaries of citizenship, right? So not only territorial boundaries, but kind of moral and kind of ideological boundaries. So in Canada, in a settler state, that has always been the case. And if we look at early kind of criminal law in Canada, the use of kind of policing, one of the earliest things that we have is the pass system, right? And the pass system was the application of kind of criminal law to particular Indigenous practices so as to define them outside of kind of political subjectivity, political acceptance, right? Technically, you could not criminalize the movement of Indigenous peoples. So instead, what they did is criminalize things like the potluck, like the Sundance, like particular hunting practices. Similarly, with immigrants, we obviously relied very heavily on Chinese labor for the construction of the Canada Pacific Railway. And so Canada, trying to maintain this kind of white nation, was like, well, what the fuck do we do? Once we've let all these people in, we need to protect the whiteness of Canada. And so we saw were things like the Opium Act, right? Things that could criminalize particular bodies. And in the Immigration Act of 1906, it was stated that one of the conditions for deportation would be conviction of a criminal offense. So criminal law was used to allow for the incorporation of migrant bodies that were needed for labor, but then also to render them deportable once their labor was no longer necessary. And so prisons have always kind of served this function. I think the key question that we want to ask is, how do these things shift over time, and who become the new targets? How do our targets change, and how do the kind of boundaries of criminal policy change? Sorry, that was long-winded.
Oh, but super interesting. I feel like I want to take notes. Thank you so much. And I think that I see a couple more people with their hands up. I'm just going to make a final last call for speakers to ask questions or make a comment, and then we'll get a chance to come back to all the presenters to sort of deal with some of those questions. And I just wanted to give voice to one thing that may have been missed in the chat, and I think this question was directed to Sarome. Fez, you said, has there been any word about holding government to their promise to recognize what they call foreign trained medical workers. So that's an interesting question, and maybe other people as well as Sarome could speak to that. So I have Michael and Sarome and Jesse, and maybe what I'll do is just, if their comments aren't too long, I'll take Michael and Jesse, and then Sarome can have a bit longer to wrap up and answer the questions, and if that's okay. Go ahead, Michael. We'll unmute you. I think we unmuted you. Could somebody unmute Michael Spears?
Yeah, I'm good now.
Awesome.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Yeah, first, this is a fantastic webinar. So many connections that kind of I had an idea of, but I couldn't kind of put down into words. So I was taking a lot of notes. I thought it was just fantastic. But I just have a question about it. It kind of goes back to what Jessica was saying about how we define ourselves and our spaces after the COVID crisis is over. And I'm thinking about like my friends and my neighbors who might you know, be able to see what's being discussed here and kind of been able to put things together. But the kind of the action that's necessary to do real change is kind of.
Sorry about that. Hang on. I'm sorry. Can we unmute Michael one more time? I'm not sure what happened there. Is my tech guy unmuted you, Michael?
There we go. I'm good now.
There we go.
Yeah, so I was just talking about yeah, friends and neighbors who can kind of make these connections, but they're kind of afraid to take the bold action that's kind of necessary because it's kind of outside of what they would think of what they can actually do and want to do. So just wanted to see if the presenters in their kind of closing remarks can kind of talk about what we can do specifically, or what I can kind of present to people, my coworkers or neighbors. You know, what kind of things can we do quickly, I would guess, in the weeks and kind of months to come to kind of make sure that we are the ones that are defining what our society looks like and not the ruling class.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. So I have Jesse, and then we're going to go back to our speakers to answer some questions and wrap up. Jesse, we'll unmute you. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks to all the speakers. Sarome reminded us that just before COVID was all the shutdowns of Canada. And it seems like it was decades ago, but it was only a few months ago that people across the country were demonstrating and saying, how do you spell racism? RCMP. And there was a real opening of a conversation around how we need to follow Indigenous law, not colonial law. And it seems like one of the responses of the ruling class have been to really try to shut down that conversation. Instead, say that the way to fight infectious disease is to turn to the most repressive colonial and capitalist arm of the state. And as Miriam was saying, that the AIDS movement really shows that you can't repress an infectious disease that only represses, you know, the people who are most affected by it. And I was noticing on her slides of the charges that have been leveled against people, that one of them was called COVID-related mischief. And I thought, I mean, obviously what the police mean by that is going to the park while black, but that, you know, real mischief is cramming people into jail cells where they can't social distance. Real mischief is overworking PSWs and not denying them you know, masks and gloves. Real mischief is reopening Cargill, the largest outbreak in the country. Is a plant which exploits often migrant and predominantly racialized and folk in the workforce. And so real mischief seems to be the incarceration, the exploitation, and all the racism which justifies it. And it seems like in this conversation around reopening the economy often seems to be around a false dichotomy where closed means closed borders and an open economy means opening up back to the previously terrible working conditions and opening up prisons to house all the people who are not obeying these laws. And so I was wondering if the speakers could discuss what a real pandemic response would look like, and you know, how we can kind of imagine a world where we can, you know, close the prisons, open the borders, close the racism, open decent work, which would not only help in this specific pandemic, but which would also make the world a far, far better place.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you so much. That was a fantastic discussion to everybody who commented. And just before I hand it back to the speakers for their closing remarks, I just wanted to mention some upcoming events just that you might want to put on your calendars. On May 14th, you may know the Prisoners' Rights Project is having an action. There's a live stream that begins at 10 a.m. Eastern time, and that's May 14th. May 21st is the day of action across Canada to demand paid sick days for all. That's May 21st. June 14th is Migrant Rights Day of Action. Again, I think that's Canada-wide, at least I hope it is. And I just wanted to invite you all to write for Spring Magazine about the struggles and campaigns that are happening in your community, and to use our publication to build deeper relationships of solidarity across Turtle Island and around the world. We want to be your megaphone. And of course, if you're interested in joining Spring or getting more involved, you can email us at info@springmag.ca, and we'd love to hear from you. So now I'll hand it over to our speakers to wrap up, and we'll just go in pretty much the same order that they presented. So Mariam, we'll unmute you, and you go ahead for about 3 minutes or so. Can someone unmute Mariam for us? Is Mariam here? There she is. Go ahead, Mariam.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Did anybody have any questions for me, or does anybody have any specific comments? I'm not quite sure what to say. I mean, ultimately, I think the thing that I found most inspirational in the research I performed was ultimately in the last 2 to 4 years, there have been across the country modifications to street checks policies, and this has been a direct result of on-the-ground activism through Black Lives Matter movement and social organizing events that often start off just as we are here today. So I think it's always important to stay vigilant and to remember that it does work, and you got to stay resilient and stay consistent.
That's excellent advice. Thank you so much, Mariam. Jessica, would you like to go ahead? We'll unmute you. Oh, tech support will unmute you. There you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciated hearing from everyone today. I learned a lot. So thank you for including me as well. In terms of what we can do specifically to change the narrative in terms of, how we proceed from here will involve a redefinition of the quote unquote nation. That happens all the time during periods of crisis. I think being kind of really attuned to and pushing back against criminalizing practices right now is really important. Flagging the ways in which those practices are thoroughly racialized. So anecdotally, we know that people are getting tickets for not practicing social distancing. There is the potential threat of jail time, and that is for quote unquote repeat offenders. Now, who is a repeat offender? Who can't socially distance? We've seen, for example, there's a web page. I'll try to remember and drop the link. But it's kind of tracking the charges that have been laid throughout the pandemic. And the only instances that we've seen so far of people being jailed for not being compliant with social distancing are Indigenous folks, who of course perhaps have very different understandings of what family is, what comprises family, and therefore for them, they are practicing appropriate social distancing with their family, their chosen family. So being attentive to the ways in which these policies are rolling out in particularly racialized ways. It's fine to go out and walk your dog if you're white and middle class, but if you're Black and want to go out for a run, in the US, you'll get shot. And in Canada, you'll probably get arrested, right, if you want to go play with your kid. So I think, really actively calling those things out. The other thing that I'd probably maybe just say as we close, which was something. Anyway, there was a question about, how can we ensure that we're not returning to the same kind of conditions? And I think one of the things that I am trying to focus on quite a bit, as an academic, I think I tend to be more critical than productive or creative sometimes. And so I'm trying to focus on the creative end as well. And so with the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, for example, we're an abolition organization. And one of the things that we want to focus on right now is that abolition is not just about tearing down prisons, but it's about building up communities. And so how do we ensure that we don't return to the same? Well, I think, we're not going to be able to rely on the state to be able to do that. We need to start building up community capacity amongst ourselves so that we can create these robust mutual aid networks that make a world of policing less necessary, right? And so that we can actually start to envision a world with less policing, less cages, those kinds of things. So, to the extent that you can, getting involved in mutual aid projects, supporting folks in your community, these are all the kinds of things that I personally would like to see. Out of Ottawa, there's some great stuff going on as well. So the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project has been doing a lot of work around this. They created a jail hotline for folks to be able to call toll-free out of Ottawa Carleton Detention Center, get legal advice, get connected to community supports, all those kinds of things. I think these are the types of projects, right, that are starting to happen, and if successful, can show that we don't need policing, right, or that we can at least start to reduce our reliance on policing. So that's kind of where I would leave that. And again, thank you all for letting me run my mouth for a bit.
Thank you so much, Jess. Sarome, we'll unmute you and you can have a chance to respond and wrap up. Go ahead.
Thanks. I think there's a couple things that I want to touch on. One, FIs, I'm not sure, let's talk about it. Also, Jessica, I'm so glad you talked about double jeopardy. So migrants who face both criminalization through, the kind of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous policing and surveilling, and then are doubly criminalized through immigration enforcement. So it was great. I want us to note that the folks in prisons and detention centers, bodies, yes, but real people, right? And real people who have been organizing. So Jesse, I'm so glad you brought this back up, right? But in my presentation, I said, we can't go back to normal. We have to refuse going back to normal. And that means that for some folks who have been organizing for decades, we're going to continue doing our work. Starting new things is great, but we must continue to organize in the ways that our migrant worker leaders, our racialized leaders, and worker members have already paved the path for us, right? So let's strengthen our efforts. And Michael, I really appreciate how you said, these are our friends, our families, our friends and neighbors, but they're also our friends and our family members, our community members. Starts with a conversation. I think today's talk is about COVID, crime, capitalism, and again, I want us to maybe kind of shift the focus on who the criminals are. Yes, there is a lot of criminalizing that's happening to our people, but let's punch up. Let's really take a look at and lay bare who the real criminals are. They are the bosses, the employers, the politicians, the people who keep this system in place, who are urging us to go back to work, who are telling us to go back to normal as if that was something great in the first place, right? So, I want to kind of close off saying to the, participants, to the 37 of us here, like, will you join us? And maybe we can even just use the raise hand function and say, will you join us and will you organize with us? We can talk about this, we can develop our analysis together, but really, will you join us? Will I see you at the next rally? Will I see you when we're, continuing to shut down Canada? Maybe we can take, I know I'm not allowed to talk a lot here, but take some time to drop it in the chat, to raise our hands, but will I see you there? Will your people see you there? Will your friends, neighbors, family, and community members see you on the streets with them? Right, so when we challenge racism, and I'm so glad that Krishna talked about this, but when we challenge racism, we're talking about challenging at the level of our unions, at the level of our workplaces, our schools, and our communities. Migrant and racial justice is a contract fight, right? These are not inseparable, right? So organize with us, organize with people who have been doing this, and organize your workplaces. Talk to your co-workers, share a conversation with them. Go to a 15 and Fairness organizing meeting. There are folks who are doing this, so join us. And we'll develop the analysis and we'll get there together, right? So I'm not sure how many people raise their hands, but let's do it.
Thank you so much, Sarome. And Krishna, you're next and we'll unmute you. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Lisa. If I was to take one thing out of this panel, it's that the struggle for justice and the struggle for anti-racism, the struggle against capitalism is very much alive. It's happening in so many different organizing spaces in this city and across this country. And it's truly such a privilege to be politically active right now at a time when people are actively thinking about how we can reshape and restructure the world that we're in. Some people may take the pandemic as a source of despair. But for us, we are taking this as a moment to say, look, we are going to challenge the way that things have always been. We are not going to allow things to go back to normal. And we are going to build a new world, a different world. And we actually believe that we can win. And the way that we're going to do that is by working together. We're going to be building alliances, not just here today at this panel, but moving forward as well. We're going to be strengthening relationships that have existed for quite some time now. And when this pandemic is over, just like Sarome said, we're going to be out there on the streets, shoulder to shoulder next to each other. We're going to support each other. We're going to lift each other up. And we're going to turn back at the bosses, at the ruling class, and we're going to say no more. We're not going to allow this system of suffering and deprivation and exploitation to continue happening. So thank you so much for everyone that's here today. Thank you so much to the panelists, to the organizers. Thank you so much to the participants. And I'm very excited to keep working with you in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krishna. Thank you so much, all of our panelists. Let's give them a virtual round of applause. If we were in a room, I know you would hear a huge round of applause, so we have to do it by video. Thank you, everybody who participated, whether in the chat or in asking questions and making comments. And thank you so much to our panelists. I feel very honored that I was able to be here listening to all of you today. I just wanted to let people know that our next spring meeting is entitled After COVID, Who Will Pay for the Crisis, which fits nicely with the call to action that Sarome and others have made. You know, we need to be involved in defining who that is. And we are still finalizing speakers and dates here at Spring. So if you follow us on Insta or Twitter or Facebook, or keep in touch with us via our email list, we'll let you know the details. And that's it for today. And I just wanted to thank you all again and say goodbye until next time. We hope we see you next time. Thank you.